understanding domestic violence in the LGBTQIA2S plus community, because it's Pride Month, y'all. So happy Pride. I am gonna, before we start, talk a little bit about women's advocates. We are a nonprofit in St. Paul, Minnesota. We offer a continuum of safety through prevention programming like these webinars. We have emergency shelter and advocacy services and aftercare housing support for victim survivors of domestic violence. We started in the early 70s as a legal advice helpline for women seeking divorce when no-fault divorce became legal. And by 1971, we purchased our 74, we purchased our first safe home to shelter abused women and children. We were one of the first domestic violence shelters in the country. And since then, it's been almost 50 years, we've expanded our shelter, we've expanded our services, and now we've expanded our mission statement to better reflect what it is that we do, which is walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. I also want to acknowledge that women's advocates work takes place on Dakota land. The area that is now St. Paul was stolen from the Dakota by the American government through centuries of wars, broken treaties, and acts of cultural genocide. And through incredible perseverance and resistance, the Dakota are still here and strong. Native women and girls face the highest risk of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner homicide. We express our gratitude for the Indigenous-led organizations who are working each day towards a world without domestic and sexual violence. And as an organization, we commit ourselves to supporting tribal sovereignty with the same fervor that we support the self-sovereignty of victim survivors. Without further ado, let's get started. We're gonna launch a poll to see what are you looking to learn about today. You can put in the chat or answer in the poll, what are you here for? But in the next 90 minutes, we are gonna get on the same page with some shared definitions. What do all of those letters mean? What is domestic violence? Then we'll get into unique dynamics and forms of abuse in queer communities. And then in part 3, we'll work on breaking down the barriers that face LGBTQIA2S plus victim survivors. And my dear coworker E is going to be presenting part of this webinar too. E, would you want to introduce yourself before I start talking a whole bunch again?
Hi, everyone. My name is E. I am the Outreach Programs Assistant at Women's Advocate. So I work with Mary Beth in our Outreach Department, and I use any pronouns.
Sick. Thank you, E. And thank you all for participating in the poll and participating in this webinar today. We're super happy that you are all here, and just thrilled to be sharing space with everybody this morning / afternoon. Before we really get into it, I have a couple of disclaimers. This is an introductory webinar. We do not have big professional degrees or big professional expertise in these areas. This is just an introductory webinar, so more information and more tools are going to be available in your further reading section at the end of the webinar. You'll have access to all of the slides with all of our bibliographies, then you can go nerd out on some of those details afterwards. Administrative detail, presentation slides and certificates of attendance are going to be available at the end. Don't worry, we have that for you. We will talk about it at the end. And then, again, take care of yourselves. Domestic violence related content does affect everybody differently. So just, again, continue to take care of yourselves. Check in with yourself. And if you need to step away, don't feel like you're going to miss anything because this webinar is being recorded. And then finally, this is our 101. This is our intro. This is our dipping your feet into the idea of domestic violence in the LGBTQ plus community. You can join us next Tuesday, 6 days from now at 4:30 p.m. Central Time, where E and Brennison will be talking about step 2, which is promoting safe and healthy relationships within the LGBTQIA2S plus community. do you want to give folks kind of a preview or like a little teaser of what to expect for that one?
Yeah, I'd love to. So the presentation that Brendan and I are working on is going to focus on primary, secondary, and tertiary intervention, as well as strategies to cultivate healthy relationships in LGBTQIA2+ relationships, and suggestions for those who work directly with LGBTQ2IA+ survivors as well.
Awesome. So we are looking forward to that. And yes, you can, in the chat, we've got a question. Can you access this webinar after today? Yes, we are recording this webinar. It'll be up on our YouTubes. It'll be sent to you in an email link in the next couple of days. Don't worry, all is not lost. All right, and without further ado, let's get into content. So part one, we are going to be unpacking the acronym, getting on the same page with those shared definitions of what do all of these letters mean. So let's do that. The acronym is the acronym is constantly evolving to include more and more identities, more communities. That's great. But what does it all mean? If you are just learning about the acronym, if you're just learning about the queer community, we are here for you with definitions. So LGBTQIA2S+ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, intersex, asexual, and two-spirit, and the plus is everybody else. Lesbian describes a woman who's physically, sexually, and/or emotionally attracted exclusively to other women. Gay is the same. It describes a man who is physically, sexually, or emotionally attracted exclusively to other men. The bisexual label, or also known as bi plus, there is attraction to same gender or sex and other. Bi does not mean men and women. It doesn't mean like I am a woman who is attracted to men and women. It means I am a woman who is attracted to women and other people who aren't women. It doesn't just mean two in this context. It doesn't just mean men or women. It includes those who are attracted to multiple or many genders. The plus in bi plus is a way to include folks who experience similar attractions but don't call it bisexual. Those folks usually identify themselves as queer or pansexual or other similar terms. There's also transgender, somebody whose gender identity differs from the sex they were assigned at birth. People who are trans might use other terms in addition to transgender to describe their gender more specifically, because gender is extremely personal for a lot of people. So this is when you might hear terms like genderqueer or non-binary. Those kind of fall under the trans umbrella, for lack of a better word. And the next part of this acronym includes asexual, intersex, two-spirit, and queer. Asexual describes somebody who doesn't experience sexual attraction. That's pretty normal too. Intersex happens, somebody who is born with sex characteristics that aren't strictly male or female. For those folks, their gender is often forcibly assigned by medical professionals at birth, based on which sex characteristics are more prominent at the time. And as they grow and develop and become adults, that could end up being consistent with their gender identity, or they could end up departing from what they were forcibly assigned with at birth. Two-spirit folks, two-spirit is more of an umbrella term within the Native community. It's more of a gender identity rather than a sexual orientation. And in many different tribes, there are 563 recognized tribes in the United States, and every tribe has a different word for what they call their two-spirit people. Two spirits, no matter what tribe they are in, often hold really important spiritual and community significance based on that gender identity. And then the label queer, describing somebody whose sexual or romantic attraction isn't exclusively heterosexual. I will say, brief disclaimer, queer is still a slur or a pejorative term in many places. It has been reclaimed as an umbrella term by many members of the LGBTQ plus community. The word queer, along with many other words, has been used as an insult by homophobes because the language of homophobia is constantly evolving. So I usually personally avoid using the term queer to describe individual people unless I know for a fact that that is how they would describe themselves, because experiences with this word, like many other words to call gay and trans and queer people, are so fraught and so varied. So if you have an inkling that that might be not a word you want to use with somebody, don't use it. In that same vein, self-identification is the most important thing. We can know all of these definitions, but what to call somebody is their choice. If you're struggling with the correct term to refer to somebody that you know or are working with, ask them. It is a basic courtesy to call somebody by the name and pronouns and identity that they want to be called. In her book, The Argonauts, which I would highly recommend, Maggie Nelson writes, quote, "The best way to find out how people feel about their gender or their sexuality, or anything else really, is to listen to what they tell you and try to treat them accordingly without shellacking over their version of reality with yours. Calling people what they want to be called is a critical part of supporting any survivor's right to self-determination. So if you're not sure, just ask." And also keep in mind, our personalities aren't defined by sexual orientation alone. Thinking about anybody only in terms of their sexual orientation flattens the many dimensions of the human soul. For many people, their sexual orientation isn't their most salient identity. We're complex human beings. We've got a lot of stuff going on. Different pieces and parts of ourselves might come out at different times, depending on the circumstances. We don't live single issue lives, as Audre Lorde says. Maybe one person's sexual orientation is less important to them than their gender or their racial identity or where they live. Like, sure, I am a lesbian, but I also like to cook. I volunteer. I'm white, I'm working class, I like gardening, I'm married. Not all of this stuff is at the forefront of my mind at any given time, but all of these things make me who I am, right? Okay. So talking about domestic violence. DV, or intimate partner violence, is a 24/7 pattern. It's designed to exert control over another person, to exercise power in a way that makes that other person be in a constant state of feeling small and afraid and unsafe. It's more than physical assault, which can, but doesn't always happen in an abusive relationship. Domestic violence is a form of psychological terrorism. And it doesn't have to be a romantic or sexual relationship. That word domestic means who's living with you. Family members and roommates can also perpetrate domestic violence. And what makes DV different from stranger violence is that the people who are perpetrating the abuse know that they're a target in an intimate and personal way. They know how to hurt somebody specifically in ways that a stranger never could. Some of those subtle ways to control those like personal attacks can snowball into what we know as coercive control, which you can learn about when we send you the PDF slides. There's a link about coercive control on the slide. We have a whole webinar that goes deep into coercive control. But all of these tactics on the power and control wheel here, all of the tactics that people who use abuse use against their partners are aimed at gaining power and control over the other person and taking away their sense of agency. While isolation, harassment, and financial abuse are all common in any gendered forms of intimate partner violence, whether the survivor is LGBTQ or not. These actually are the ones most commonly experienced by the LGBTQ community, and they also have particularly dire consequences for queer people. LGBTQ plus people are particularly vulnerable to verbal harassment and financial abuse as power and control tactics because they experience higher rates of bias-motivated violence in other areas of their lives. So, moving on from that, I want to introduce some concepts. This idea about misconceptions is going to stay with us throughout the rest of the webinar. Which of these misconceptions have you heard of before or have you believed before? These are all pretty common misconceptions about domestic violence and intimate partner violence in the queer community. And I want to know, how common are they among the people who are attending this webinar? Because I know I can tell you for sure that they were pretty common for me. I believed a lot of these at first. For a long time, I thought that domestic violence was a straight people problem. I wanted to believe that DV was directly attributable to patriarchal norms and standards, and that it was a direct consequence of men's hatred of women, and that queer lives and families were immune to interpersonal violence by some virtue of being liberated from heterosexual norms and dynamics. And I was real wrong about that. And of course I was wrong, because even though domestic violence usually occurs in a gendered context, it's not only about gender, it's about power. Domestic violence is about one person's belief that getting what they want matters more than anybody else's freedom and safety. And that is a belief that can happen in people of any gender, any sexual identity. So it's not just a straight people problem. It happens to all of us. All right, I'm gonna give folks just a couple more seconds to fill out this misconceptions poll. And if you have questions about any of these misconceptions, feel free to put them in the Q&A or in the chat function. But it's looking like a lot of us are have been stuck in similar boats here about these misconceptions. Let's see, the most common ones are that the domestic violence incidents in LGBTQ plus relationships are not as severe as those in heterosexual DV. Let's see, another one is that you can tell who the abuser is in a same-sex relationship by who's bigger and stronger. And then finally, the most common misconception is that DV in queer relationships is the same as DV in straight relationships. We'll get to address and correct some of these as we go along. But it does happen to us. It happens to queer people. Intimate partner violence within LGBTQ plus communities has not, unfortunately, it has not been integrated into that mainstream narrative on IPV, and limited culturally specific services exist for queer survivors or queer perpetrators of abuse. And this is both because of and contributing to all of those misconceptions from the previous slide. If there's this widespread misconception that domestic violence doesn't happen in queer communities, then nobody's going to say that there's a need for domestic violence programs that address queer people. The original goal of that gender paradigm in intimate partner violence, the idea that men are perpetrators and women are victims, the original goal of that was to right a really old, ancient inequity against women. The goal of this gendered paradigm was to recognize that women weren't just being abused by nobody. It was men. Somebody was abusing women, and usually it was men. This was a really important statement to make at the time that the battered women's movement began. And it still is. It's important to recognize that when we talk about violence against women or violence against intimate partners, somebody is doing that violence, and we need to figure out who that is so that we can stop it. Unfortunately, though, that gendered paradigm has contributed to sort of a heterosexist model of abuse that involves a very violent or controlling man and a very passive woman. And it ignores the fact that people can experience or perpetrate abuse outside of the heterosexual dynamic. 20 years of research estimates that rates of domestic violence in same-sex relationships are actually pretty comparable to those of straight relationships. The rates are the same or similar. However, fewer non-straight people are coming forward to report, hey, I've been abused. My queer or same-sex partner has abused me. Fewer of us are coming forward than straight people. And that is due in no small part to the pervasiveness of those misconceptions. All right, a couple more direct statistics about IPV in our communities. 83% of bisexual plus women will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime, compared to 55% of straight women, 67% of lesbian women. That is a huge discrepancy. In addition, trans women are twice as likely as other genders to face intimate partner harassment. They're 3 times likelier to report being stalked than cisgender survivors. And in a study of male same-sex relationships, only 26% of men called police after experiencing near lethal violence. I will say, information about some types of intimate partner violence and the number of LGBTQ plus identified people experiencing it, that information and research is pretty spotty. It's lacking. There's not a lot of it. When we were researching for this webinar and looking for statistics, we kept hearing or kept reading, not enough information, more research is needed, numbers not reportable. There is a dearth of research. So, quick call to action. If you're in a position to, consider doing your part to advance research on this subject, because the more we know, right? So if you can, please do. And these statistics aren't to say that any one group has it worse than another. It's just to encourage solidarity, because all of us are affected by domestic violence. It is statistically so likely that you have worked with, lived with, studied with, shared public transportation with somebody who's experienced abuse, as well as somebody who's used abuse in their relationships. And it is not at all uncommon for people to realize during these webinars that they've experienced abuse. And maybe they never called it that because they thought abuse was reserved for other people. Maybe they thought, like me, that abuse was for straight people or cis people or people who were being physically assaulted. But all of the stats on the screen right now show that relationship violence can and does happen in our LGBTQ plus community. And as difficult as that is to reconcile, hopefully it helps you feel less alone. People who experience abuse will carry it with them for the rest of their lives. There are a whole bunch of different ways that experiencing abuse can impact our sense of well-being and our sense of self. The impacts on physical and emotional health are deeply intertwined. You can't separate them. 84% of survivors are diagnosed with PTSD, with post-traumatic stress disorder, and that can cause traumatic nightmares, which can lead to insomnia. 77% of survivors are diagnosed with depression, and 75% of them are diagnosed with anxiety. And those two things can manifest in physical illnesses like migraines, chronic pain in the chest, back, or pelvis, trouble breathing, and symptoms like IBS, like gastrointestinal harm. Experiencing harm from somebody who's supposed to love and support you can also significantly mess with all of your systems. It just turns them all upside down. The way you think about yourself and the world, your ability to concentrate, your memory, your ability to make decisions for yourself and your life. The emotional scars from abuse are often kind of waved away, but survivors tell us that long after the bruises heal, it takes even longer, an astronomical amount of compassion and patience and professional support to even begin to heal from the scars on the heart and mind. Experiencing abuse can impact the type of job somebody can have, the ability to trust somebody in new relationships, their relationship with money. The effects of abuse show up in so many different ways. And it's really important for us to understand all of those effects in order to be truly trauma informed for the people that we're serving. And then keeping in mind that we don't live single issue lives. An LGBTQ plus victim survivor can't choose day to day whether to be a survivor or a bisexual person. They're both. They're indivisibly both. You can't be one or the other. And so they face something called the double closet. The double closet is a phrase coined by Ellen Kashak, and it came out of something called minority stress theory. The idea that stressors experienced by people from marginalized communities are both unique to their minority statuses and additive. So that means that the harm of one experience is compounded because they're experiencing it in the context of existing oppression. The double closet refers to specific stressors of queer survivors. So LGBTQ plus people who are experiencing partner violence face discrimination born from internal and external homophobia, and also from the stigma of being a victim of partner violence. There are two barriers to receiving assistance for these folks: coming out as LGBTQ plus, and then additionally having to come out as a survivor. I am going to turn it over to E now for unique dynamics and forms of abuse.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much, Mary Beth, for presenting the first third of this presentation. And thank you all for continuing to post in the chat and ask questions. So as Mary Beth said, I'm going to talk about unique dynamics and forms of abuse. So one thing that I wanted to preface with was this graphic, which was adapted from the Western Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. It kind of situates an individual and shows broader social forces that impact their life and their relationships, such as internalized homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, which we will get into very shortly, as well as discrimination in social settings and broader social forces. The importance of framing and understanding internet partner violence in the LGBTQ community in the broader context of anti-LGBTQ bias, racism, ableism, and other forms of discrimination. It's vital that we understand unique vulnerabilities to IPV and the unique barriers to accessing services that LGBTQ communities face. And that is a quote from NCAVP. I think it really explains that along with the theory of the double closet, LGBTQ survivors have a lot of broad social forces that they're working through and with. So as I mentioned, the term internalized homo/bi/transphobia. So it's internalized homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. For those who have not heard of this term before, I'm just going to go over what it is and what it isn't. So what it is internalized oppression, such as holding oppressive views about one's own community. It's caused by prolonged exposure to oppression and discriminatory attitudes. It can be conscious or unconscious. It's kind of like the common understanding that these are all harmful and exist. We can internalize them without a person realizing it. We may learn or be impacted by intolerant behavior by those around us, or by societal depictions of LGBTQ plus people, or even through institutions such as laws, policy, culture, healthcare, or education. Someone who is working through internalized homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia may inadvertently repeat or internalize these statements even when they belong to those communities. This can cause a lot of stress, anxiety, fractured or strained relationships, and deeply harm interpersonal relationships. It can prevent survivors from reporting abuse or leaving an abusive relationship. But one thing that it isn't is an excuse for abusive behavior. It may be a potential reason individuals may not report their abuse or leave their relationship, but this is not an excuse for abusive behavior to happen. So one example of this is from internalized to weaponized. So those who struggle with this internalized homo, bi, or transphobia can then externalize it onto other people. The abusive person projects their internalized hatred of self and community onto their partner in ways that minimize, justify, deny, or directly contribute to their abuse. So here we have some speech bubbles that have some examples of how this might happen, such as saying, oh, women can't abuse women, so what I did to you is an abuse, or saying, you defended yourself, so you're the real abuser. Self-defense is more common in same-gender or same-sex domestic violence than in heterosexual relationships, where an abuser is usually a man and a victim is usually a woman. The abusive person will use a victim's use of self-defense to say that the victim is actually the abusive one. So painting the abuse as mutual or just a fight is an effort to control the victim into not naming their experiences as domestic violence, not identifying as being a victim survivor of abuse, which then alienates them from seeking that support. So now I'm going to go into a couple more specific forms of abuse that LGBTQ individuals might face. This is not all of them, and not all of them happen in an abusive relationship between LGBTQ individuals, but these are just ones that Mary Beth and I found through our research that were especially pertinent. So the first four here are having to prove the identity that you have, such as forced public displays of affection or forced participation in unwanted or objectifying sexual acts, which also ties into sexual hierarchy. So the abusive person saying, using gender roles to control what a partner does sexually, even when it doesn't align with their gender identity, with phrasing such as, well, to be blank, you have to do blank. Another form of abuse that may happen is willful misinterpretation of identity. So this includes stereotypes such as saying, well, all bisexuals cheat to exert control over a person who may identify as bisexual, or withholding hormone replacement therapy from a partner who may be transitioning. Another one is threats of outing. This includes threatening to out an individual as LGBT or in a same-sex or same-gender relationship to people such as their family, children, or friends, or employer if they want to report their abuse. For bisexual women dating men, there can be a dangerous intersection of misogyny and biphobia as well. Stereotypes surrounding bisexual people being promiscuous can lead to increased sexual violence and rape if partners willfully misinterpret or assume their bisexual partner is up for anything. Bisexual women who do not consent to objectifying sexual acts or who strongly identify with the LGBTQ community might be at increased risk for violence from straight masculine partners. Another thing to note about threats of outing is it's a form of emotional abuse. It's psychological and emotional leverage over a person who has to keep their orientation private to avoid consequences of homophobia and transphobia, such as losing their job or losing custody of their children. And if you notice, actually, Mary Beth, when they were presenting that circle of power and control, threats of outing was on there as well, and using children was on there as well. So now we're going to go through an example scenario after learning about some misconceptions and some specific forms of abuse. So I'm just going to read the story out and then I will launch a poll as well. So the story is, your friend Alicia has been dating John for a few months. Alicia's bisexual. John knows and claims to be okay with it. Oh, be fine with it, my bad. One day, John showed up at Alicia's work and saw her give a female friend a hug. John suggested a threesome with that friend, and Alicia declined, telling him that wasn't an okay thing to say to her. John grabbed her by the arm, called her a slut, and accused her of cheating. So I'm going to launch a poll now related to this scenario about what you would do if you saw this happen. So the options are A, you would tell Alicia that John's behavior was concerning and offer to help her find advocacy resources. B, you would ask Alicia if she was sure she wasn't trying to make John jealous by hugging her friend. Or C, you would tell another friend what Alicia said and hope that they would do something to help. So we've got a lot of responses so far. I'm going to give folks a little bit time here to read over that scenario and vote on the Zoom poll. You can also drop it in the chat if the Zoom poll is not accessible to you. Okay, I'm going to share the results now. It looks like everyone who voted in the Zoom poll voted for A, which is great, which was you would tell Alicia that John's behavior was concerning and help her find advocacy resources. Option B is really based on those misconceptions that we covered in the beginning about what people think about saying relationships where one partner might be bisexual. So a lot of people, what if they don't question those misconceptions or haven't had the time to think through them, may say B. They may say, well, since you're a bisexual woman, maybe you're trying to make him jealous. But thankfully, everyone here recognized that even though Alicia is bisexual, what happened wasn't okay and offer to help her resources. I'm going to go over a couple more specific forms of abuse now, and then we'll have another scenario. So a couple more forms of abuse that LGBTQ plus individuals may face include exploiting a lack of support. So this is the abusive person saying phrases like, you'll have nowhere to go if you report this, or there are no resources for LGBTQ survivors out there. They may threaten to out survivors to gender-based support services or social services that deny support to LGBTQ plus people. Another specific form of abuse that may happen is using small communities. This means isolating their partner from LGBTQ social spaces or threatening them with a loss of access to these spaces if the individual reports or leaves. This may be especially harmful if the abused person has that support community and really relies on that support community. Another specific form of abuse that may happen is leveraging institutional violence. So the abusive person threatening the abused person with threats that institutions will not take the abuse seriously or they will criminalize the survivor. Saying things like institutions are less likely to believe you over me. They may out these individuals to these institutions, or they may weaponize the pathologization of being LGBT. And then another specific form of abuse that LGBTQ individuals may face is the policing of identity and expression. This means the abusive person telling the abused partner they have to act or look a certain way to be gay or be lesbian or be transgender. Or on the other hand, their partner saying, well, I don't want you to look gay or look a certain way or flaunt your identity. You may have to act or look a certain way to pass or be accepted as the gender that you identify with by your partner, even if you express your gender differently. So here's another scenario. I'm going to launch the poll for those who like to read ahead, and then I will speak it out loud. So the scenario is Rebecca and Janet met at the mall. When they first began dating, Rebecca was very sweet. Over time, she started putting Janet down and once ended a fight by slapping her. Things got worse, and Rebecca told Janet if she ever left, Rebecca would tell Janet's homophobic parents and workplace about their relationship. If Janet told you this was happening, and then we have three options. A, you would ask her why she hasn't just come out to her parents to get ahead of Rebecca's threats. B, you would tell Janet you care about her and offer to help her plan what to do next. Or C, you would ask Janet if she was sure Rebecca really meant what she said. You'd heard relationships between women couldn't be that bad. So I'm going to give folks a couple more seconds here to select what they think in the poll section. All right, and I'm going to close the poll in about 5 seconds. So get your responses in if you haven't, or you can drop them in the Zoom chat if the poll function isn't accessible to you. Awesome. Thank you all so much for continuing to participate. So I'm going to share the results. A lot of us said B. We tell Janet that we care about them and offer to help them plan what to do next. Some folks also said A and C. And I think that goes back to some of those misconceptions we had. I know one of the most popular misconceptions that folks put in that poll was that in LGBTQ relationships, the bigger or stronger person is the abusive one, or that abuse isn't as bad if it's in a same gender relationship. I think that's definitely a misconception that a lot of people unfortunately hold. But I think that what would be best in this situation is to offer Janet support and do what she wants to do. There may be many reasons that Janet hasn't come out to her parents or her family or her workplace, and those should be respected, even if that means taking a different route to confront the abuse that Janet is facing. Thank you all so much. We're going to move on to the third part here, which is to break down the barriers that LGBTQIA2+ victim survivors are facing. So we're going to talk about barriers to leaving and also institutional barriers that they may face. So some barriers to leaving an abusive relationship for survivors that are LGBTQIA2+. There are countless misconceptions about why survivors are unable to leave abusive relationships and situations. People who experience abuse are faced often with an impossible and gut-wrenching set of decisions and barriers to navigate, oftentimes on their own and with very limited resources and support. This is part of the reason why it takes survivors an average of 12 to 15 attempts to be able to successfully leave an abusive relationship. There are an endless number of reasons for why staying might feel safer for a survivor in that moment, or why leaving would pose challenges that the survivor doesn't have the capacity to overcome. It's not our place to say what we would do in the situation or what they should have done to avoid experiencing abuse. Survivors deserve compassion and non-judgment. And even if a survivor leaves, it does not guarantee safety. Leaving is the most dangerous time for survivors since it disrupts the power and control by the abusive person. And if leaving isn't fatal for the survivor, many experience long-lasting impacts from abuse or continued abuse even after they've left. So some of the ones on here include financial barriers, fear of being outed and harassed while seeking services, fear of homophobic violence being more pertinent than the fear of the abuser's violence, or insufficient protections that vary state by state. But some good news is that LGBTQ survivors are now eligible for domestic violence protections in all 50 states. If you download a copy of these slides, you can click on the link on this slide to learn more about that. That is awesome news for survivors who are working to leave their abusive relationships.
Yes. So let's get into some barriers. One barrier to LGBTQ plus survivors accessing safety are insufficient or inconsistent or just plain not okay responses by law enforcement. Unfortunately, law enforcement hasn't really been required to be trained on either the specifics of domestic violence and even in straight relationships, but definitely not prioritizing training on domestic violence in LGBTQ plus communities. They might get to a domestic situation and not have any idea what to do because they believe some of those misconceptions, like, oh, well, it's not really as bad, or oh, the bigger one is the perpetrator, we'll arrest them. This can lead to arresting both partners at the point of intervention, arresting no partners, or arresting the wrong person. Law enforcement might treat the incident as a stranger assault or not intimate partner violence because they don't understand that these people are in a relationship. And any of the follow-up resources that they're required to give out to survivors might be super heterosexual. And so the LGBTQ plus survivor might say, well, thanks for this little blue card with your number on it, but it's useless for me. I'm not a woman, or I am a woman, but my batterer is not a man. And also perception of police response is a factor in this barrier too. Anticipation of homophobia and discrimination by police officers during a police response has actually been shown to contribute to lower rates of contacting the police when experiencing IPV. So LGBTQ plus people might say, oh, well, I've heard that police responses are useless or police responses are harmful, so I don't want to deal with that, so I'm just not going to call them. And even though that perception is inaccurate in some cases, in some police departments, that perception on the part of queer people is not without context. There is a long and brutal history of criminalization of LGBTQ people. There are still cities and states with laws on the books that directly criminalize LGBTQ plus ways of life. Thinking about the gendered clothing laws, the 3 articles of clothing that was a law that was enforced in big cities in the 50s and 60s. There are also many states who still have anti-sodomy laws on the books, which maybe they're not enforced, but they could be. They could be enforced to get a better record for prosecution. Most states don't enforce those really gross and discriminatory laws anymore. But for decades, there were really brutal, violent police crackdowns on the LGBTQ plus community based on those laws, and that memory lives on. When LGBTQ plus survivors do contact law enforcement during an incident, there's still the risk of that insufficient response, as I mentioned earlier. There was a study done on Texas police departments statewide to determine how they responded to LGBTQ domestic violence as opposed to straight domestic violence. And those police in Texas were significantly less likely to make an arrest in a domestic situation involving a same gender couple than a domestic involving a different gender couple, even when the victim was willing to cooperate with an arrest. And so all of those issues don't even get into the issues of decarceration and abolishing police and the effectiveness of the carceral system for IPV. Even without all of that, we're still having issues. That history of criminalization leads to queer community mistrust and anticipation of harassment, which then leads to fewer calls to 911 or law enforcement, which leads to missing out on intervening or getting safety for those people. So breaking down this barrier would mean culturally sensitive programming for first responders, for law enforcement, for court personnel, to really understand, like, what does DV look like in queer relationships? How do we respond compassionately and in a trauma-informed, victim-centered way to folks who are experiencing domestic violence in a queer relationship? If any of your programs have relationships with local law enforcement or court personnel or first responders, please consider doing some training for them. The more training we do, the more opportunities for connection that we have across disciplines and across departments, the easier it gets for survivors to access safety. And then barriers to support, even if they can seek safety. Misconceptions, like the ones that we have talked about throughout this webinar, lead to barriers to accessing support. You'll see a couple of them on the screen from queer survivors, that people were more focused on my gender identity than on the harm I was experiencing. Or people kept saying I should have defended myself because we were both men, so I just stopped talking about it. People assumed that my abuse led me to be attracted to the same gender because I came out during the time I was being abused. When I think about the many, many misconceptions that surround queer people and intimate partner violence, and about the very sparse literature until recently at least, that exists about its prevalence and its patterns. When I think about that, I think about the phrase, you can't be what you can't see. If you are a lesbian in a relationship and you had internalized the idea that women don't abuse and same-sex partner violence doesn't exist, whether you've been told that directly or just not been told that it was possible, if you're a lesbian who has internalized all of that and then your partner starts to insult or assault you, how would you know to call that abuse? How would you know that that was domestic violence if you believed that domestic violence between women was impossible? Would you know that you could seek advocacy or protections? Maybe not. If our communities aren't talking about it, and if advocacy centers aren't proactively reaching out to our community through partnerships or marketing or even just flyers that have two women on them, or a visibly gay person on them, how would you even know that those programs were there for you? Service providers and those who are responsible for marketing and communications and maybe outreach at your organization, you can help break down this barrier. You can help correct these misconceptions and breaking these barriers to support by creating materials that feature LGBTQ plus people and address domestic violence in the queer community. If you proactively do the outreach, if you build it, they will come. So please consider doing that.
I was muted. I'm going to talk about another barrier to healing, which is exclusionary service practices, which includes medical homophobia and transphobia, gendered supports, and heteronormativity in reporting and support, and how these all kind of lead to a lower likeliness of survivors reporting their abuse, seeking their support, or participating in programs. So in a 2010 study by NCAVP and the National Center for Victims of Crime that surveyed 648 domestic violence agencies, sexual assault centers, prosecutors' offices, law enforcement agencies, and child victim services, 94% of respondents said they were not serving LGBTQ survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. Additionally, survivors who identified as men were far less likely to be able to access services, particularly domestic violence shelters, due to the heteronormative understanding of IPV that exclusively looks at cisgender men abusing cisgender women. Exclusionary service practices keep many transgender women from accessing the support they may need. For example, medical homophobia and transphobia can impact survivors in the following ways, such as transgender and gender nonconforming individuals may face transphobic or otherwise invasive questions when seeking medical care. LGBT individuals may face homophobic rhetoric when seeking medical care, such as misconceptions about sexually transmitted infections. Medical professionals may not receive the specialized support and training they need to be able to truly support LGBTQ victim survivors when they are seeking medical care related to their abuse. Transgender and gender nonconforming individuals may not be aware of support that is open to any gender. Domestic violence supports in their area may be restricted to specific genders, and individuals may not know if they are trans friendly, because if a shelter says that they support women, folks may not know if that means transgender women unless they make it clear. When victim survivors want to report, they may also face heteronormativity in that reporting, like Mary Beth said, when it comes to talking with law enforcement. Individuals may not want to report their experiences of abuse because maybe their legal documents do not match their chosen name or reflect their gender identity. Some states do not have the X gender marker like Minnesota does. So in some states, individuals may want to have an X gender marker or have a different gender marker, and that is not legally possible. And that may be a barrier in their reporting. Reports may use gender language or otherwise binary gender markers in the reporting process as well. This may deter survivors from wanting to report their abuse as they try and jump through bureaucratic hoops, but also homophobic hoops. So one thing we really need is culturally sensitive programming for medical institutions and institutions that support folks in facing domestic violence and intimate partner violence, that are culturally sensitive and have resources, either make it clear that they are there for LGBTQ victim survivors or receive training on how to best support them. So one thing that Mary Beth and I wanted to talk about after doing all this research is how organizations can begin to do this if they are seeing this work and want to make sure that their organization is doing the most they can to support LGBTQ plus survivors. So these are some things that we thought of. This is just a starting point for organizations to think about how are we best supporting LGBTQ survivors. So do they have staff equity training specifically on LGBTQ plus issues? Do they have a non-discrimination policy that includes sexual orientation and gender identity? Do they have LGBTQ staff members, and are they supported in their work? Do they advertise or make people aware that their program welcomes survivors of any gender or sexual orientation? These are very baseline steps, and your organization might already be on their way to completing all of these, which is awesome. And once organizations are able to complete these, they can gather more feedback from the folks that they are supporting on where they can continue to grow their advocacy skills for LGBTQ plus people. So now I'm going to get into some language to avoid and language to embrace that kind of goes along with this. So we're going to start with avoid. Some language to avoid might be over apologizing or saying, you know, I'm really going to mess up. Here in Minnesota, we have something called Minnesota Nice, which is very passive aggressive, kind of like over apologizing kind of statements and phrases. And this may make the process really frustrating for the victim survivor. Saying stuff like, but your driver's license says you're female. What's up with that? Or saying that their pronouns are confusing. Asking these irrelevant questions breaks the trust that folks have with victim survivors. They may feel put on the spot to disclose additional information in an already vulnerable situation, going back to that double closet. This may break the trust and stress the victim survivor's trust. And these questions are usually irrelevant to the support they need. A lot of these questions are not questions that need to be asked to do the work that we need to do. So now some language that we can embrace. This includes language that really puts the power back in the victim survivor's hands. So saying, you know, feel free to correct me at any point in the process. I'm not an expert, but that's no excuse. If I say something harmful, let me know. If you make a mistake, apologize, move on, keep it in stride, and work on not doing it again. Respecting the survivor's boundaries. So if the survivor doesn't want to be out to anyone but you, respect those boundaries, and let the survivor know, like, you get to choose who you tell about your identity. If a survivor says, you know, my name is this, even though it's not that in the document, respect that, continue to use it. Or if you have an LGBTQ member on your staff, and that LGBTQ staff member is supported, maybe ask the victim survivor if they'd feel more comfortable meeting with them. Centering the impact of our words, validating victim survivors, and respecting their boundaries as an LGBTQ person and as a victim survivor builds trust and reinforces self-determination. It shows that there is a space for them at your organization for them to receive that support that they need.
And finally, let's talk about supporting holistic safety real quick. At Women's Advocates, we emphasize the importance of holistic safety, safety in all areas of life, because abuse impacts all areas of life, all of our dimensions of wellness, and all types of safety. It's important that our safety planning that we do with survivors, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, addresses all of their dimensions of wellness. So it's really important to support holistic safety for queer survivors as well. And sometimes when we're working with a victim survivor, or if we're supporting one as a friend, we could spend a lot of our energy on helping that person achieve physical safety. We want to immediately fix things. We want to write a restraining order. We want to get them into shelter. We want to walk through escape routes and police reporting. But not every, especially with queer survivors, a lot of those things might not be useful to them or helpful at all. And in addition, abuse creates more than just physical scars. So it's important to support holistic safety for queer survivors as well. And for those of us who are advocates or survivor advocates, we need to think about our own holistic safety too, because the difficult stories that we hear from survivors of all genders and orientations stay with us, and we need some emotional strength to be able to hold those stories. You can learn more about holistic safety by downloading our personalizable safety plan worksheet, watching our safety planning webinar on our YouTube channel. I'll put in the chat some links to those. But we are in part 2 of this, of our Pride Month webinar series. We're going to get into how to support and promote holistic safety for LGBTQIA2S+ survivors. So this is not just to say, oh, and by the way, safety is important, and then leave you in the lurch about safety. This is to say, safety is important. Let's talk about it next week. But as a community, we can all be involved in violence prevention and intervention in our own unique ways. We all have different gifts and enthusiasms. So on the screen, there are a lot of different options and actions that you can take to contribute to a community free of domestic violence, a community that talks about DV in the LGBTQIA2S+ community, and supports survivors of all genders and orientations. You can contribute to a world where cycles of violence and patterns of violence are broken. You can help us breathe life into healthier and happier relationships. And as we come to a close, and before we start answering questions, I'd like you to think of some ways that you can dedicate yourself to showing up for queer and trans victim survivors where you live and work. So if you would like to add those actions to the chat and maybe hold yourself accountable or give other people suggestions, feel free to do so. I am going to put in the chat a link to all of those safety planning tools that we had available on the previous slide. But yeah, what can you do? What can you do to support victim survivors who are LGBTQIA in your program or where you live and work? You can put those in the chat if you'd like. But should we answer some questions, E? I think we have somebody in the Q&A who says, let's see, how do we address sexual violence and intimate partner violence happening to queer folks without seeming dismissive to what happens to women? I brought it up in a webinar once and the presenter seemed upset that I mentioned it. Okay, that is fair. I've been thinking a lot about this question too. Like, how do we say in spaces where we're talking about sexual violence prevention or domestic violence prevention, how do we say, okay, women and okay, queer people experience this too, without derailing? And I think it comes down to messaging. You don't want to appear like you're bringing that up in terms of in a way that derails the conversation. You don't want to be saying, okay, but what about, or, oh, well, you didn't mention queer people, so this presentation is useless. I think it is important when we're talking about domestic and sexual violence prevention to recognize that, yes, largely women are experiencing it, and largely women are not taken seriously when they do experience it. But it's also, I don't know that it's a presenter's fault for not not talking about how queer people experience domestic and sexual violence at the same time, just because we haven't been having these conversations for very long. But what you can do is when you're building presentations, rather than when you're attending them and saying, oh, by the way, queer people also. When you're building your own presentations, you can begin to address, not just by like erasing the word woman from your presentations, because that doesn't really work, but you can say like queer people also experience this, and it looks different, and prevention might be a little different. And you can emphasize making those services and those prevention strategies accessible to people of all genders and orientations. But I do think it is still important to recognize the outsized impact that sexual violence has on women, and also to recognize that queer people and women are not two separate entities. Like it's like saying women and people of color. Like there are women of color, there are queer women in the world. And so when sexual violence is happening to queer people, it is still happening to women. I don't think that is a statement that would derail any conversation. It shouldn't. But as long as you are bringing it up in good faith, bringing up that concern in good faith, rather than bringing it up to totally derail or discount a conversation, I think it's fine.
Yeah, I would just like to very quickly add on, Mary Beth. I definitely agree that there are queer women out there, and you brought up those stats earlier about the rate of abuse that specifically bisexual women face as well. So when we talk about domestic violence that women are facing, making it very clear that when we make our own presentation materials, or when your organization makes their presentation materials, making it very clear that when we talk specifically about the experiences of women, that doesn't just include straight women, and adding those statistics about the harm that bisexual women and lesbian women also face can really help folks begin the conversation on how DV impacts everyone without taking away the focus from its disproportionate impact on women.
Yeah, we're not trying to be at each other's throats. Like the people who perpetrate violence and people who uphold systems of oppression want us to be at each other's throats like that. They want us to engage in infighting and picking at each other over small things. We need a focus on solidarity and class consciousness among oppressed peoples, because if we're constantly picking at each other, or trying to one up or be in bad faith with each other, we're not going to be able to we don't have the energy or the time or the perspective to turn around and say, wait a second, who's actually doing this? Whose fault is this? Who is causing this? Because oftentimes it's not us. It's not the oppressed groups. So let's turn our attention away from picking at one another. Maybe we solve our issues together. Let's focus less on infighting and more on taking down the top, and more on like breaking down those systems of oppression.
If folks have any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Make sure your chat is set to everyone so folks can see your question, or use the Q&A function if that is accessible to you. I know this was a lot of content in very quick succession, so we welcome any questions.
Yeah. And I do think somebody has put in the chat, and it accidentally went just to hosts and panelists, but violence against women is absolutely important to talk about. It can often overshadow violence against the LGBTQIA2S+ community. I would agree there is some instances of that happening. Absolutely. I do think, again, like I think sometimes we can derail one another. Different oppressed groups can derail or try to detract from conversations about other oppressed groups by saying, oh, but we also are oppressed. And I think that's why solidarity is really important. Because again, we don't live single issue lives. We're not just women. We're not just queer people. We have all of these different identities together. I think rather than derailing, it's about uplifting, and we need to focus on uplifting and working together to take down the systems that are oppressing all of us, namely violence, patriarchy, racism, capitalism. Rather than saying queer people are detracting from the violence against women movement, or women are detracting from the queer movement, like we need to say, hey, how about we all be in movement together? I think solidarity and class consciousness is going to be really important in overcoming this.
Yeah, and to add on to Mary Beth's point about single issue lives, I know that the word intersectionality is used so often, and it's kind of lost a lot of its power and its meaning. But when Mary Beth was talking about single issue lives, I think about the fact that when we were talking about those barriers to support, such as medical institutions, law enforcement, or other institutions that someone in the chat brought up, that doctors can restrict non-emergency care based on their own religious beliefs. Those systems of oppression are all interconnected. So the same institutional violence that LGBTQ people face, a lot of the same institutional powers also impact other people, such as people of color and folks of marginalized genders, such as women. So I think when we talk about these different forms of violence, they can impact the same person in multiple different ways. It looks like we have another question in the Q&A section here, and it's saying, how would you suggest a women-centered org be inclusive of LGBTQ survivors? All of our language is women-centered and non-inclusive of trans folks, LGBTQ folks, etc. I want the language we use to change, but I don't see that happening. Mary Beth, do you want to tackle that one?
I sure do. And you're at a webinar hosted by a program called Women's Advocates. So we recognize that we are also engaging in some of this same behavior and some of this same exclusion. I think it's important to have conversations with your organizational leadership to say, hey, yeah, we're mostly helping women, but recognizing that you're gonna get lesbians looking for help too. And if women who identify as lesbians are going to your program and hearing like, oh, you don't serve us, or like there's no language that tells them, hey, it's okay for me to be here as someone who is a woman who was abused by a woman, they're not going to reach out to you. So it's important to be proactive in your messaging, to say, maybe have a poster or have flyers at Pride festivals around your area that say, hey, we know that women abuse other women. You are welcome here. Yes, if you're tabling at Pride, this person is saying their organization is tabling at Pride, you can say, yes, we know that that abuse happens in our community, in the queer community. We are here for you, and then actually be there for them. But you can't necessarily just say that as one individual for an organization. You can't go table at Pride and say, yes, I believe our program accepts trans women, and then a trans woman tries to call and gets told by another person at your organization, oh, we don't actually serve trans women. You gotta get your org on the same page. And that's pretty tough to do. It does take a lot of conversations, but it is important. So continue to have those conversations and say, listen, I think it is necessary, not just important, but necessary that we let people know proactively that we have these services available. Ooh. Yeah, somebody in the chat saying it's really important to decentralize our services, centralizing them around the community rather than the service provider. That is, yes, absolutely. Not all of your services have to be concentrated in your shelter building. If you have a shelter that is only open to women, you don't have to allow, like, you can have another program at another community site that is a place that male survivors or non-binary survivors can show up to. You can provide more opportunities for connection outside of your physical space, and that might open things up a little to survivors of multiple or diverse genders. I also want to, for folks who are who are interested in the community divide between like women and queer people, I want to recommend to you a book called The Women's House of Detention: A Queer History of a Forgotten Prison. That is chronicling a women's prison in New York City that was across the street from the Stonewall Inn, and housed incarcerated thousands of straight and queer women, and people who did not fit into the typical understanding of what a woman was, what a woman is. There is a whole storied history of women and queer people and queer women being criminalized in this prison system, and that book does a really good job of addressing that and addressing the solidarity that happened among those communities.
It looks like we have another question in our Q&A box, and it says, is there any official training regarding involvement with LGBTQ plus communities in schools / law enforcement? Yes, Mary Beth said no. There is no official training. We are going to provide some resources that we use to create this presentation, as well as organizations that offer services specifically to LGBTQ victim survivors. And we encourage you to look through these resources. I spent hours just going over the breadth of information that is out there. It's not like Mary Beth said, like a lot of more research is needed, but the breadth of information that is already out there is so vast. And I think that a lot of these organizations might have trainings or presentations that can be provided in schools or to law enforcement, and you can partner with these organizations to work on that. So there's no official training regarding this, but we invite you to look through the resources we're going to provide to see if you can find an organization who could offer that to your organization.
Yes, because what we have to understand about the public school system and also about the police departments in this country is police departments have no federal oversight. They are not all bound together by the same set of federal laws. All of these different states and cities and municipalities have different training requirements and laws on the books. So where one city could require that their police department have a certain amount of hours of training about domestic violence, another city right next door could say, oh no, you don't have to do any training for that. So what you can do is, if you do have an interest in putting together a training, or you have a training put together, what you can do is build a relationship with your local law enforcement agency and offer that training. There's no way that federal law could require that sort of training amongst all police departments at this point. The Supreme Court would have a heyday. But what you could do is partner individually with your own community programs and say, hey, we have this training. We would love to partner and offer it to you. That's the same with schools. You can go to your local school district and say, hey, we have this training. We'll offer it to you. But there is no federally mandated requirement for any school district to engage in any of this training. Those educational requirements are left up to the states. Yeah, so just partner with your local programs. because we do need this training to go to as many people as possible. We need everybody to get on board, but not everybody's on board yet. So that's where you all come in. Yes, somebody's saying creating partnerships with community-led and focused agencies to guide your services. Yes, because yeah, we might know people's situations, but we don't know everything. We don't know all the nuances. So it's important to let these communities, like if you have relationships, you should build relationships with LGBTQ plus programs or specific interest groups or clubs. You should be building those relationships so that you have people to ask to come in and present or to consult on specific cases or specific issues. You need to be finding the people in your communities that you can ask to answer questions, and then compensate them for asking, because queer people are really tired of explaining their existence to non-queer people. So please compensate them for their efforts. We work really hard to prove our humanity to the wider community every day, and we don't really see a cent of that. So don't just ask people to tell you about themselves for free. But yeah, do ask people. Any other questions or general comments or thoughts about how we can all be more committed, more active accomplices in breaking down these barriers for the community? Yes, ask your clients their pronouns and then respect them. Asking is one thing, ignoring it is another. Yeah, ask your clients and use their pronouns, and don't assume that their abusive partner is a particular gender based on the gender that your client is. Love that. Yeah, when in doubt, just ask. Don't be like invasive or gross or rude about it, but just ask.
I'm going to go ahead and move forward showing some of the resources that we compiled for this presentation. If you have any other questions after this webinar, there is a space in our post-webinar survey to ask those questions so we can get back to you as well. But I'm just going to go over our resources really quickly. So this page has some specific Minnesota-specific resources. We are in Minnesota, so there are some on the left here, such as Violence Free Minnesota, as well as Day One Minnesota. On the right, there are some national and international sources, such as the National Sexual Assault Hotline, as well as international resources such as the ones listed. These are specifically for domestic violence, and our organization's also listed on there. And then here are some organizations that work specifically with LGBTQ plus communities. So on the left, again, we have some Minnesota specific ones, such as Reclaim and Family Tree Clinic, which we have done presentations with Family Tree Clinic in the past. They're a great resource, as well as some national and international resources that we found on the right, such as the Trevor Project, and then some further reading. So on the further reading page, all of these are embedded links, so you can just click on them when you open the presentation and get to that page. So we have articles, as well as books, as well as academic journal articles, just for further reading and for further research. And they all have the statistics and graphics that we showed in this presentation. And I have to click the next button and I lost it. There we go. So thank you for your commitment to survivors' safety. Thank you for your participation in this webinar. Here's our specific contact information and ways to get in touch with our crisis resource advocates. You do not have to live in Minnesota or in a specific country to reach out to us. And then Mary Beth put the safety planning link in the chat. I'm just going to drop it again one more time. This is our safety plan. We also have QR codes. So if you have a smartphone, you can use the camera on your smartphone to open these links, such as our live chat and our crisis line that you can add to your contacts. And we have a post-webinar survey. It really, really helps us out if you're able to fill out this post-webinar survey. You can copy down this link. I'll drop it in the chat as well. Or you can take the survey, which will be listed in the post-webinar email that'll go out later today. So it's tinyurl.com/WA understanding DV survey, and taking the survey will help us out an immense amount in our programming, both for later this month and as we continue as an organization. And I'm going to turn it to Mary Beth to conclude our presentation.
Yes, thank you, E. So much fun to present with you. Thank you all for attending this training today. Go ahead and follow us on your socials if you would like to do that, if you have socials to follow us. We have a super great communications coordinator. She puts out excellent content. And then you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel to help us get to 1,000 subscribers and access all of our webinars and educational videos. If you want to download this content right away, go ahead and scan your QR code. Otherwise, we will still get this stuff to you later in the day via email, but you can do that now if you're a little impatient. And here is a link to join our monthly listserv and check out upcoming events if you would like to continue engaging with us. And then if you would like a certificate of attendance, you can do that at this link where you can manually fill in the date and your name, and then boom, you have a certificate of attendance. Thank you all again so much for being here. We're going to stop recording, but I am so grateful for all of you for showing up.